nothing, right down to those purple eyes underneath the veil. The two of them stood there facing each other with the whole Grand Temple at their backs. So who exactly is hiding under that veil, wearing somebody else's name? Isn't that right, Rian?